Hey everyone! Before we get started with this week's episode of Within Orb, I wanted to invite you to check out the CAELi website and see the new labs we have on offer. Drew Levanti from a prior episode, as well as Nate Spear and I are all teaching labs this coming spring, and you're invited to check them out and see. So what is a lab at CAELi? It's a more experimental, horizontal, a little bit anarchy kind of way of learning astrology where we recognize that everyone comes to the table with their own intelligence, and together we can make our astrology better. So the lab instructor is more of a guide through the material, but everyone comes and gets their hands dirty. We had a really beautiful lab with Jay Hamadi, and I've also taught a lab about open houses. And so start to look for more of these around CAELi, and I'd love to invite you to go check it out. So without further ado, let's jump into today's episode. Thanks. The Within Orb podcast. Come get Within Orb. Welcome to another episode of Within Orb, and today we're heading out to the Eastern Seaboard to speak with Alissa. Alissa, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
So you and I met last year at NORWAC and just had the most amazing conversation. So I'm so glad that you're here with me on Within Orb and I get to pick your brain kind of in public, but let's just get started straight away into it. What was your first astrology book?
So I think multiple people have mentioned Linda Goodman's sun signs on this show before, probably, but that was definitely hugely formative. I was raised by someone who felt very strongly about being a Virgo. Both of my parents are Virgo suns. And that book was sort of presented to me. And I remember it was the first time that I really felt seen to a certain extent, that there was things about, I felt very strongly about being a Scorpio. That was the way that I was raised ultimately. So that was definitely huge in terms of it being my first introduction to the different zodiacal archetypes and the ways in which they kind of can manifest in different types of people. I definitely, having reread it recently, there are a couple of things now that I have more training that I kind of noticed. She mentions in the intro that you can have Venus in Cap if you have the sun in Gemini, which, so that at least in the edition that I have. So that is a little bit of an issue. But if you have the basic knowledge, which I think we'll get to later on in terms of my books that I suggest to beginners, then that's something that you're going to catch right away.
Awesome. I didn't even know that was a typo in there. Maybe a typo / editor should have caught that one.
Well, she's talking about how, obviously it's not just a 12-letter alphabet, that there's a whole chart and that different placements can mitigate the sun sign, even though the sun sign tends to be fairly loud.
Yeah.
And in the example that she's choosing, she's saying, so if someone has the sun in Gemini, but it's also possible that they're, maybe they have their Mercury in Scorpio and that makes them very, and so it's like, oh no,
wait a minute.
That's not correct.
What planet is this person born on?
Yeah. As someone with my son at the very end of Scorpio, I know that that's the only reason why I'm able to have my Venus in Cap, because she is, I think, a couple days away from the greatest elongation. So even that is not as common. But anyway, so that was interesting to me that I happened to catch that. But at the time in my childhood, it was huge for me. And it was definitely the beginning of my kind of learning about intergenerational patterns in families and sort of sign placements and the way that those tend to kind of repeat over time. Because as I mentioned, both my parents have Virgo stelliums and I have a Virgo moon. And that's all kind of conjunct in a major way. And then my maternal grandmother has an Aries stellium that's right on my ascendant. And my kid has a Virgo moon that's conjunct both mine and my mom's. And their Scorpio ascendant is on my sun and south node. And so there's just a lot of kind of heavy connection in that way. And I'm just so fascinated by those patterns and the way that they repeat over time. And so I think that was ultimately kind of the first step toward me starting to really focus on intergenerational patterns in the chart and also on kind of early childhood and dynamics in the early life and in the family. Something that, as I started looking at charts, started to kind of jump out to me very quickly. So I really did, that was very much kind of rooted in Linda Goodman for sure. And then also as a kid, I think I was always just kind of looking for anything that was about esoteric topics. Or I remember I have a very vivid memory of finding a book on palm reading in my elementary school library. and teaching myself how to read palms and looking at the lifeline and everything, and then starting to sell readings for a quarter. So that was kind of that.
Genius. Entrepreneur already in elementary school.
Weirdly, I had forgotten about that, and then I actually at Norwich last year, I was in Austin Kopic's workshop on Ficino, and he was talking about Ficino's techniques for finding vocation in the chart. But then he also happened to mention that another way to find it, other than using this technique, is to just think about, what did you want to be when you were a kid? What was the first thing that you were doing? You know, that's often kind of just the soul calling you. It's much louder when you're younger. And so I realized over time that I've just always wanted to give readings, do readings, be involved in that kind of work, both in terms of divination. I do a lot of predictive work with clients, but also more about just kind of seeing stories and sitting with people and seeing all of that. So yeah, so that was the beginning. And it ended up being just that for a long time, actually until Neptune was in the second decan of Pisces, which was ultimately in exact opposition to my moon and square to my Mercury at the same time. And that basically, I felt sort of everything that I was trying to do at that moment started to kind of fall away. And I was trying to start a custom fashion design business, and I was trying to do work with modifying patterns, fabric patterns. And then it got to the point where it felt like the numbers themselves were starting to move around and shift. And I couldn't kind of do that type of, Virgo work, that mercurial work. But then at the same time, it felt like kind of my intuition started to come online in a new way. And that was when I started being drawn to taking more formal astrology classes.
Wow. That's amazing. I wish I had been able to grow up around astrology that way, but it came for me somewhat later. And nevertheless, all right, so let's ask you the big question of the day, which is, if you were going to be stuck on a deserted island and you could take an ephemeris with you, what 3 books would you put in your luggage?
It was interesting. What I ended up with was actually a couple of books that to a certain extent kind of feel more cookbooky and less philosophical. The first one being The Combination of Stellar Influences by Ebertin. When I first started learning about combination of planetary energies in any kind of way, or learning about sort of basic delineations of those things, that book was very useful to me. But I wasn't as interested in the beginning or the end of it, and sort of learning about the dial and all of that. And so I've only recently started kind of spending more time with that element of it. When I chose this, in part, I was thinking about what I would want to do if I had that kind of dedicated time. And I feel like it would be, I can imagine myself having a lot of fun kind of playing memorization games with it, kind of going through it and trying to, call through different pages or what have you. It's a lot of fun to look at. And it's also fun to kind of combine that approach to looking at planetary aspects with things that are much older. And so actually the second book on my list is The Beginning of Wisdom by Abraham ibn Ezra. And Ibn Ezra in general is very important to me. As I'm a Jewish astrologer, I feel that my Judaism and my astrology very much influence each other. And as I got deeper into astrology and thinking about that cosmology, the more I started to feel that awe that actually made me feel closer to my Judaism. And I am very into Ibn Ezra because he is very well known as a Bible commentator. I do not think that as many people are familiar with his astrological work, at least within the Jewish community. And so I was really surprised to discover that all of these things that I was learning in Astrology 101 can also be found in these texts that were, written by these, by Jewish, people who were commentating on the Torah specifically. And so even the ones like Maimonides, who were actively against the practice of astrology, against divination, all of those things, still incorporated the zodiac and knowledge of the planets into their worldview. And the explanation of those things was actually, in terms of the celestial sphere and everything, is always a part of the way that they present that. And even now, you can look at the Orthodox Union website and find out what which month in the Hebrew calendar it is. And whenever they talk about that, they always include which astrological sign is associated with that particular month. So it's still very much central in a lot of ways. And that's important to me. And so there were a lot of, obviously, sort of Hellenized synagogues a long time ago. Obviously, in terms of Jewish history, this is controversial, but people who valued the zodiac enough to include it in their houses of worship. And that's meaningful to me, that's something it's kind of baked into it. And even recently, I was sitting in synagogue, and I was looking at the menorah and thinking of that as kind of just a model of the 7 visible planets, and sort of seeing that as being central to, the lights. And in Hebrew, all of the names of the traditional planets have different meanings. So, Jupiter, for example, is tzedek, which is translated as righteousness or justice. And Venus is noga, is beauty, or the shining one, basically the bright one. And so I started noticing the ways in which those words are woven into our liturgy, and we talk about them. And I'm starting to kind of think about the planetary energy as being what's being called to as being sort of an element of the divine, not thinking of them as individual beings, but being, having consciousness, being a part of something that is ultimately alive. So that's how I started to look to Ibn Ezra ultimately. And I really love the ways in which he describes the fundamental energies. I think that it's very important to consume kind of these fundamental texts that are written by people from very different times with very different perspectives on the astrology. I'm always wanting to see, okay, this is how Ibn Ezra describes Venus versus this is how Gadbury describes Venus, and trying to find, well, what of these ultimately resonates with what I see in charts, what I see in other people's charts primarily. I was going to say in mine, but I'm actually very terrible at looking at my own chart.
Right.
In general.
Yeah, so triangulating from the tradition and then cross-checking it with direct experience from the now.
Exactly. And that's actually one of the things that I love that he does in that book and in all of his books. I feel when it comes to his basic descriptions of different elements, he'll say the wise men from Egypt and Babylonia describe it this way, the wise men from India say this, and this is what I think. I would love it. My hypothetical student, my astrological student, would be able to present things in that way, sort of know the fundamentals of multiple traditions at the same time, ultimately. That was actually something that I learned very quickly after starting to go to NORWAC and sort of coming in and everybody having their different astrologies and having their conversations. And it was so exciting to be in that environment. But you definitely, I think, need to have a fundamental understanding of what the different sort of groups are saying in order to be able to see where people are coming from.
I wholeheartedly agree. In fact, right here on my table at CAELi, I have a book called Astrologies, Plurality and Diversity from Sophia Center Press. So
I love that.
Definitely a value that is held here too.
I need to find that.
Yeah. That's amazing. And also how the way that the planets show up inside the religious text, in a sense, where they're hiding in plain sight, or if you're in tune enough with the currents, you can pick up on it. But it's not an overt thing where you're saying, like, we call upon the powers of Venus, but you're like, but you're calling upon the powers of Venus, right?
For sure. In terms of Judaism specifically, from my perspective, actually one of the biggest things is about the planet Saturn. And this is actually a focus of some of my research right now. Obviously, I call my practice Saturnine astrology. I feel like I'm very much heavily impacted by Saturn in a lot of ways. And one of the things that not only Ibn Ezra, a lot of the older sources will say that the different planets have rulership over different types of people or different types of worship. And one thing that's very consistent is that Saturn is the planet of the Jewish people specifically. And so I've always been interested in what does that mean on a technical level in terms of astrology. And so, in terms of talking about the names in Hebrew, Saturn is Shabtai, or the restful one, the one that stops, basically. And obviously, the Jewish Sabbath is on Saturn's day. and which I found interesting. And then I started thinking about the timing of the different, what we call basically 4 New Years in the Hebrew calendar, and the ways in which the luminaries are aspecting the Saturn's domicile, exaltation, etc. And that's started being interesting to me. And so I'm starting to try and put together some research or write something that's kind of explaining to astrologers the Jewish element of it, but explaining to people who are more well-versed in Judaism where the astrology is within it. And there is some scholarship on this already, so I'm in the process of doing some work, I think. But what's interesting is that what I'm finding is actually things that are sort of seeing that Saturnian correlation or association, and seeing that as ultimately, because Saturn is a malefic, ultimately a bad thing, and sort of saying that this is actually, this is an association was ultimately somebody casting aspersions. Whereas from my perspective, obviously as big and as heavy as Saturn is, I think so valuable and very important, and I don't see it as an inherently sort of evil.
Yeah, no.
And so I'm interested in that, but that is something that I've been looking at.
Yeah, the 20th century philosopher Walter Benjamin sort of tacitly proudly claimed to be a child of Saturn as well in his own way. I mean, he was German-Jewish philosopher, outcast in his own profession, actually, never really included in the systems of legitimacy that he was seeking to achieve over the course of his career. And I think he very much enjoyed being aligned with this planet of failure, right? Like he's sort of like, I'm a child of failure in this beautiful archetypal way. Maybe not archetypal would be a word he would use. Actually, he'd probably be mad at me for even saying that in the same sentence. But, very much in the sense of like, there's so many people, even I think in the Saturn and melancholy, the traditions of melancholy that you see throughout the Renaissance and even earlier medieval times, where people are a little bit proud of claiming Saturn as an ally on that front. Like, it makes me a scholar, right? If I'm a child of Saturn, I get to be alone in the tower writing the book.
I can certainly relate to wanting to revel in it. I think that's something I would love to get there. I think for me, the element of that energy that's been closest to grasp onto is about fear, ultimately. But I definitely, one of the things that makes sense to me in terms of a correlation between Saturn and the Jewish people throughout history is the sense of being on the margins. I think of Saturn as the boundary, and then Capricorn being what's within it, and then Aquarius being what's without. And there are a lot of people who actually say that both Saturn being the planet of the Jewish people and Aquarius specifically being the sign, which I think is interesting. I do see a lot of heavy Aquarius placements in the charts of a lot of prominent Jewish people. We were recently at my synagogue noting that both of the most recent presidents had birthdays a couple of days apart in Aquarius season. I also have Aries rising and my Mars is in Aquarius. So I feel very closely connected to that energy as well.
Walter Benjamin literally has Aries rising in Mars in Aquarius.
So actually, that
I was
makes
just going to say that to you, but then you said it first.
So that actually, I can really, the idea of having, for me, Mars is the out of sect malefic, which is interesting, kind of embodying that in your own chart. But having that Mars in the 11th and sort of having there be a consistent pattern of both the idea of belonging to a group being of the utmost importance to you, but also feeling like there's always some sort of a separative quality, like there's a reason why you're not able to, the cohesion isn't there, or there will be kind of repeated conflicts that lead to you just sort of like, storming off and leaving. That's definitely been a very strong pattern for me. And I'm sure there are a couple of people I know who will watch this and laugh or listen to it. But yeah.
With you, hopefully, no. Oh my, oh my, oh my. Okay. Let's step back away from the edge of that Saturnian. Is there anything, before we leave Ibn Ezra and go to your third pick, is there anything that Ibn Ezra says about Saturn that has been a guidelight for you or some kind of like comfort?
So what's coming to mind is that there has been a book or a resource that was particularly helpful to me, but it's not Ibn Ezra, and it's not one of the ones that I mentioned.
Okay, so the honorable mention, the book you didn't bring is, and that's very Saturnian to be like, the one that wasn't included. Let's call it in.
So it's actually the Greatness of Saturn by Robert Svoboda. That was really huge for me. And actually, I think that's right there. I initially got it when I was going through my first waxing Saturn square after my Saturn return, which was quite difficult. It was a very heavy time for me. Mm-hmm. And I think it was Jessica Lanyadoo on the Astrology podcast mentioned it just sort of offhandedly in the context of something else. And they talked about how the book is sort of so big and heavy, but very kind of work in a useful way. And so that was something that I picked up then. And just sort of having the reading of the book itself as a remediative practice was very interesting, and kind of turning that into a nightly ritual, kind of, washing my hands and feet and lighting a candle and sitting down and just taking in some of this story and actively inviting in that Saturnian energy was very, very good for me. And I am disappointed because I had another opportunity over these past. Now the Saturn is where Neptune was, or had been where Neptune was, and that was also activating that for those very sensitive placements for me. I think that would have been something that was useful as well, and I didn't avail myself of it then. But the book was really huge for me for that reason, and also ended up being something that also helps the research that I'm doing into Saturn. Because at the end of the book, he talks about some of the different ways to remediate Saturn transits, Saturn placements. And I started to notice a lot of overlap between what was being suggested in the book, or what's being used specifically to kind of remediate the effects of Saturn. There's a lot of overlap between that and Jewish practice in terms of on a daily basis, in terms of the repeated, the repetition of mantras, the periodic fasting, even certain communities have a custom of wearing a lot of black or darker colors, which is another thing. And then also the act of just resting. Something that I've been reading recently is actually in terms of our Sabbath. Obviously, during the day, it's ruled by Saturn, but then also the Friday night is ruled by Mars. And so that's the one kind of full day of the week that's kind of ruled both the night and the day by Malefic. In the Hebrew calendar, the day starts in the evening, actually, because of the way the days are described in the Torah. So there's evening and morning, the first day. So the day starts at night. And it turns out that one impact of never beginning or ending something during that kind of 25-hour period is that you're ultimately electing to not kind of have any project going that's just started or stopped during that particularly malefic period. And I thought that was really interesting, sort of a nationwide remediation or a way to avoid certain things in terms of the impact of the malefics. I thought that was very cool.
Oh my goodness. That's so smart.
And obviously I can't speak to whether or not that was purposeful or to what but it happens to be the case.
Yeah.
So I thought that was cool. And so it definitely motivates that type of practice in a different way if you're coming to it from an astrological perspective.
Now it makes me think everybody needs to take a Sabbath, even if they're not Jewish, because of the electional component to it,
I think that a lot of people would benefit from a pause, an enforced pause in a lot of ways. So, for sure.
Imagine stepping into a room of 5,000 astrology books, turning a corner and stepping into a room of 2,000 more. The Celestial Arts Education Library is every astrologer's dream, and it can be yours. I invite you to come support CAELi before you can visit physically. Your support will mean the creation of 52 new episodes of Within Orb next year, 4 issues of the CAELi Review, our inaugural journal, and countless book talks, events, classes for our community. Visit our website, www.caeli.institute/support, to select your level of care. Please help support CAELi into the future, our future, so that we may study the future together. Thank you for listening. Please enjoy the rest of the show. All right, so what would your third pick be?
So this is pretty different than the other two. It's called American Histrology by Ronald Howland. And it purports to suggest an alternate chart for the United States. He's ultimately working off of research that was done by the Library of Congress before the bicentennial, where they found several primary documents that actually show that the Declaration of Independence was signed in the morning of that day, which moves the ascendant of the chart from mid-Sagittarius to late Virgo. And it's ultimately relatively straightforward that he's able to demonstrate that everything that was written at the time ultimately points to it being a morning chart. And then he ultimately spends the rest of the book, a couple of hundred pages of different charts showing the impact of the late mutable degrees in both events and also the natal charts of people who are major in American history. And I have read all of the initial part and gotten into some of the charts, but there's just so much there. And I feel like that is a book that I would be able to get a lot out of if I had more time to spend with it. Even kind of, I can see myself making a game of trying to, okay, from Ibn Ezra's perspective, how would he delineate this as a horary or whatever? I feel like that would be fun, but it's just not something that I have done already. I really love that book. And I'm surprised that it's not better known or it's, I don't really see a lot of people using any other chart for the US than other than the Sibley. I feel like it's sort of generally accepted. And it is something I've been thinking, now people have been talking a lot about both the Pluto and the Uranus return of the US. And now we have Neptune right at the end of Pisces is now, according to his chart, really activating the angles. He talks about Jefferson Davis being made the president of the Confederacy when Neptune was at that place, or kind of. And so I'm actually interested in watching all of the shifts that are going on right now from the perspective of that chart as the radix for the US instead of the Sibley. And so, yeah.
Wow, I love that challenge to the domination of the Sibley chart. I think if you start talking to people doing mundane astrology, there's still people arguing about which chart is the chart of the US.
I think that there should be. I've certainly, at the very least, been convinced by this book that it should be more of a conversation. And he's also using techniques that I don't personally use. Like, one of the pieces of evidence that he has is that right around 10:55 that morning, there was I think it was a Uranus local space line that was cutting through Philadelphia, Boston, and London at the same time. And it turns out that if you kind of follow that line down the Eastern Seaboard and then also, fully across the Atlantic, in the United States along that line, there tend to be places where there were major technological advances or places of civil unrest in a notable way. And then he also mentions, I think it was Lindbergh flying across the Atlantic and followed that path specifically. And I thought that was cool. And so it's definitely, that's another thing is that one of the things that I want to have with me is books by people who are doing things that I'm not doing and things that are challenging.
Yeah, to spurn you on to a new development and get your technique repertoire widened.
For sure.
Very cool. I don't know if I have a copy of that here, but now I'm curious to look and see because you're making me want to read it.
It's very cool. I spent some time, I managed to find it online on one of the thrift bookstores,
Sure.
But it's relatively beat up. But I wanted to get it anyway because it wasn't easy to find, but I was so curious. And I'm really glad that I got my hands on it.
So in the hundreds of pages that follow from this thesis of the chart for the United States being different, are those moments in American history? And so it's effectively also a history book, just through and through?
Yes, very much so. Yeah.
Okay.
So it's very much a narrative from the Declaration going up to, he looks at 9/11 and things like that. And sort of, because I think it was ultimately published maybe just 10, 11 years ago. It's not even that old, I don't think.
Wow.
It's very specific moments in time that are known to be major events in US history he's looking at, and particularly when he has the time chart for it. So it's definitely also on top of that, a history book. You can get into it if you're primarily interested in the history or if you're primarily interested in the astrology.
Amazing. Amazing. Okay, so if you were going to suggest to a beginner where they should begin, What books come to mind?
As with my desert island books, 2/3 of them are ultimately cookbooks or books of delineations. I do think that it's good to have that. I don't think that it's good for that to be the only thing that you're working out of. Having a place to start in terms of, looking at moon in the fourth, etc., I think it's good. So the first one is actually John Gadbury's Doctrine of Nativities and Horary Questions, which was something that was just given to me in a PDF in a class a couple of years ago. And it turns out that I actually return to it a lot. When I first started doing chart readings, they were blind chart readings, and I was having to learn how to basically put together narratives based on what I was seeing. And there were definitely multiple times when I found something within that section where he talks about the houses or the planets in signs and in houses that fully unlocked something for me. The example that comes to mind actually is the moon in the fourth house and him talking about deriving joy and both joy and fortune from either the land itself, kind of agriculture, or architecture. And I was looking at a chart for someone with the moon in Libra in the fourth, and I sort of mentioned both of those things. And it's someone who studied architecture in college and is now a farmer. That wasn't part of my classroom education in terms of different placements, but he just put that just right out there, and it turned to be literally true, and I really loved it. I don't know if it's about all of my Saturnian stuff, but I do have a tendency to value things that are older. My approach is weird in that I very much like to put together kind of unvarnished delineations of things. But at the same time, I feel like my focus is on holding space and working with people with heavy pass. But I find it helpful to start with just very clear, maybe even slightly harsher, but just more frank delineations of things, which is easier to get sometimes in older sources. But yeah, I do. I love Cadbury. I don't know why, but he just made sense to me.
Cut your teeth on Gadbury.
And the other cookbook on my list is CSI, again, the combination of stellar influences. I would very much want a beginner to be able to kind of receive both of those approaches to basic things at the same time, and then be able to, like Ibn Ezra say, the people in the German school are describing these kind of combinations this way, and then, whereas this is what Gadbury says about the Mars, Jupiter, or whatever. And so I think that's very important to me. And I also, one of the things that I value about CSI that I wasn't getting in other texts earlier in my practice was it does have some basic information about the biological impact of these different things, whereas the other books that I was looking at were really focusing primarily on the psychology of it. But to kind of actually be able to look at what Moon Mars might mean for someone in a female body, for example, or something like that, which it definitely ends up heavily influencing the ways in which I put together, particularly blind chart readings, and like kind of my understanding of what it might feel like in someone's body when I'm trying to kind of wear the chart. It's definitely informed. The foundation of it, I would say, came from combination of stellar influences. Certainly, I want to say, important to not be, I don't consider myself to be a medical astrologer. I don't make diagnoses or anything like that. But one of the things that I've found makes it easier for me, both just in consultation with a person, but also when doing prediction, is being able to look at the chart as if I am that person. And particularly when I'm trying to do a solar return or something, being able to think, okay, if I have this mindset, how am I likely to react to this transit as it's coming, helps me kind of predict what might ultimately happen. So yeah, so that's why in that sense, it can be helpful to have an understanding of what it might feel like to be in someone's body. So right. I do really love CSI for that. And also because it's something that you can first kind of focus just on that section of it. And then as your knowledge grows, return to it and kind of dig more into the cosmobiology of it all. Yeah, so that's CSI and Gadbury. Those are my two cookbooks. I'm learning that I always want to have two cookbooks with me. And the last one is actually, it's called Simply Math, a comprehensive guide to easy and accurate chart calculation. I think that it's so very important for people to be able to learn how to calculate a chart by hand, primarily because I think that it's important to be able to look at a chart wheel and to the extent to which you're able kind of visualize what that means in space-time, right? And I think only one of the several kind of foundational classes that I took in astrology even kind of approached that element of it. And I fear that something can be lost if you don't kind of bring it back to, okay, this is what it means for there to be an ascendant, or this is where the midheaven is, and it's not the point that's directly overhead. You know, I think that definitely influences your ability to kind of make choices, like, for example, about which house system you're going to use. If you don't really know what that means, you're ultimately just kind of receiving it as wisdom, but you're not kind of making that choice for yourself. And obviously, I think ultimately, I think that you have the correct answer, which would be it's whichever house system is appropriate for the technique you're using at that moment. But I do. But anyway, I love the way that the book very clearly kind of lays out, this is what it means that the earth is round and things are, you know, over the course of a day, how much everything has moved and all of that. I really love it. And it's so good at motivating every step in the process, which is so much better than just memorizing steps, things to do. Because then if you don't understand why you're doing it, it's much harder to kind of recreate it. Whereas I love the way that they particularly set it all out, because you understand what all the different calculations are. So you can kind of, if you're not remembering a particular step, you can reason it out. And that can be a lot of fun. And then I guess, again, in terms of it being something that I haven't fully gotten through, I'm realizing when I picked it up again, I never did the last bit about calculating composites and Davisons and all of that by hand. So looking forward to getting into that. And that's the other thing also, is that it does contain very clear explanations of several types of derivative charts, you know. So laying that all out at once, it's just really beautiful. And I think that should be a part of everyone's kind of foundation.
That's amazing. I had a Saturn transit bring me that problem when I began learning, because I had my computer taken away. So I had to calculate charts by hand from the very beginning. I didn't ever receive a calculated chart. So working through the math was how I began for at least 6 months to a year at the very beginning of learning astrology. So I don't really know any other way. But if you think about it, before computing became widespread, most of the community had to calculate charts by hand. And I think that also helps you realize that this isn't just Linda Goodman sun signs, because suddenly you're computing, you know, spherical trigonometry and creating a depiction of the astronomy of a moment and learning about how the earth moves and how that affects local space time. You know, yeah, I'm really impressed that you want to give that to a beginner from jump, because a lot of times it's like, oh, learn the symbols and learn the signs and learn the kind of, you know, the aspects and such. And it's like, yeah, but if you learn the astronomy of it first and learning how to, then the mathematics, you know, astrologers used to be called mathematicians, then you're inextricably like into the stream of it. Like you can't get escape. It's like you're in it, you know?
I do, absolutely. And to be honest, I think that it's not always wrong to gatekeep certain things. I think that astrology is huge and very complicated and powerful, and can be dangerous in the wrong hands. And I feel like the more I learn, and even now after I've started seeing clients, I've actually it feels like I know less and less because I'm more aware of everything that's going on around me. I'm very much not an expert. And I don't necessarily think that it's always positive to try and make this as digestible and as simple as possible. I think that there's absolutely value in learning to kind of interpret your own chart, maybe. But I do think that we've, with this in Neptune and Pisces era, have moved into a place where I think that there are a lot of people who are thinking that astrology can be essentially broken down into memes. And those people are now providing guidance to other people, and that worries me. So I would really love to have there be a standard to a certain extent, but maybe that's my Virgo or my Capricorn or what I think, I think it's not bad to be rigorous.
Yeah. All right. So where can people find you?
I am primarily quiet at the moment, but I'm on Instagram at Saturnine Astro, and same on Blue Sky. You can, particularly on Instagram, you can find links to some testimonials and my bookings. Other than that, I'm hoping you'll see me in person at Norwalk in a couple of months.
Exciting.
That's the most wonderful time of the year, I always call it. So looking forward to that.
Well, thank you for taking the time to be here and sharing your love of astrology books and all of the things that you do.
Thank you for having me. It was great.
Thanks for listening to Within Orb. If you loved this episode, share it with your friends, give it 5 stars, leave a comment. In Spotify, you can do that now. To learn more about the CAELi Institute and perhaps become a member or take a lab that we teach, please go to CAELi.institute. That's CAELi.institute. Thanks again to the E-Block Band for providing our intro and outro music, and also to Jen Brown of JJ Boots Productions for being an excellent producer. If you would like to have a podcast be edited like Within Orb, reach out to Jen. This is Jenn Zahrt, signing off for now. See you next week.